President Donald Trump has signed more than 75 executive orders within 3 weeks. Some have had domestic impacts, others are all over the map. Most reflect much of his rhetoric on the campaign trail, but experts say a few could cross the red line. To give us a sense of what's happening in Washington and how the next 4 years might look like, we have with us Ambassador John Bolton. He served as the 25th United States Ambassador to the United Nations and also the National Security Advisor to Trump from 2018 to 2019. Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for speaking to me.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Let me start with Middle East, Ambassador. What are you making of Trump's proposal for Gaza?
Well, I think you have to look at it in two pieces. The first piece is what the U.S. role will be. Trump has proposed that the United States own Gaza, that we take control of it from Israel as part of the ceasefire, but that we would apply no military force, presumably to protect people working there. This is a total non-starter. It's not going to happen. I don't know what the U.S. role will be in Gaza, but my guess is it will be very, very limited, if at all. I don't know where this idea came from. I don't think that Gaza is about to become the Eastern Mediterranean version of the Riviera. I think this is all a complete dream. But second, the question of what happens with the Palestinians is a very live issue. And although for many years people have talked about a two-state solution, at least my own view is the two-state solution is dead. I don't think the Israelis will ever accept it. I think it was probably dead before the barbarous Hamas attack of October the 7th, but in any event, it's now dead after that. And I think similarly, rebuilding Gaza as a high-rise refugee camp is not an answer either. I mean, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. It really poses the question that I think everybody has been trying to avoid for a long time, which is whether the Palestinians don't have to face being resettled somewhere else in the region. They were radicalized and treated by Arab leaders like Gamal Nasser of Egypt in the 1950s and 1960s as the tip of the spear against Israel to drive Israel into the sea. That obviously isn't going to happen. But today, many Arab states worry that Hamas, which is still very strong among the population of Gaza, is just a subsidiary of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they fear terrorism in their own countries if they bring in Palestinians. So I think the humane thing to do for the Palestinian people is to treat them the same way refugees everywhere else in the world have been treated since 1945 under the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. The worst place to be is in a refugee camp. And anybody who's ever been to a refugee camp can tell you how mind-deadening it is. So the two alternatives UNHCR follows is either repatriation to the country of origin, which is not going to happen here, or resettlement. We're not talking about forced resettlement. The country to which they might go has to agree, and the refugees themselves have to agree. But let's be clear, UNHCR does not run permanent refugee camps. This is a big issue. It's going to be very hard to resolve. But I think Trump has it by maybe inadvertently, but he has definitely put that question front and center now.
So, as you say, if Arabs are refusing for security reasons, Israel has said a categorical no. And I don't think Trump even wants to be part of the dialogue. Where will the Palestinians go? And what about the fundamental question, why should they leave Gaza?
Well, I think there has to be a discussion of how to find a way to accommodate the concerns that many Arab states have, and maybe that almost all Arab states have about resettling the Palestinians. And maybe you need a more gradual process to have a kind of de-Hamasification, analogous to the denazification efforts in Germany after World War II. I've heard reports that of a population in Gaza of about 2.1 million, between 100,000 and 200,000 have already left. They've been able to bribe their way out, or they've been able to get out by sea. Nobody knows what the exact number is, but a number of Palestinians are trying to leave already, some successfully. I think others would want to. So there ought to be ways that recipient countries could have confidence that they're not importing people that are going to radicalize and try and overthrow their own government. Nobody can object to a country being concerned about that. But at the same time, we have to recognize that putting them all back into Gaza simply isn't going to work. The number of people who are legitimate Gazans as opposed to refugees over one period of time or another, I don't know the number for, but I think it's in the hundreds of thousands, not in the millions. That's for sure.
Ambassador, what is your view of the way Trump is using tariffs as a tool against other countries?
Well, almost everything Trump does is a negotiation. So almost everything he says is a negotiating tactic. And that's in part true for the tariffs here. But it's a very dangerous game to play. We, the United States, have not been in a real tariff war since the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930. And that didn't turn out well, as we all suffered from the Great Depression. So I think the risk of tariffs and then retaliation is very real this time, and the risk of a trade war is therefore very real, and the risk to the economies of everybody in the globe is at stake. Trump doesn't understand tariffs. I've been in the room when it's been explained to him that tariffs are paid by the American importer, who then tries to pass this tax, which is what it is, along to the American consumer. He doesn't believe it. He said as recently as his inaugural address, the foreigners are going to pay more. Well, it's not the foreigners who pay the tariffs. A trade war is a mutually destructive way to go about things. We've spent decades trying to build a more orderly international trade system. The real problem here is China. Everybody admits it. If you take, for example, except the Chinese, of course, if you take, for example, the Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum, the Chinese have overproduced both commodities. They've dumped steel and aluminum into the international market. They've undercut producers in every country around the world. It would be better for us to deal with what is really the main problem in a joint way, getting people who want an international free trade system to work, rather than the U.S. getting into a fight with its closest friends and allies and having China only as kind of one of the participants. It makes no sense from the perspective of what the real problem is, which is China.
Right. Since you talk about U.S. allies in China, let me quickly bridge that. Some of U.S.'s friends in smaller countries are blaming Trump for being a bully. Do you think Trump's maximalist threats can actually push all of these countries towards China or Russia?
Well, I think there's a risk that the way Trump approaches international affairs will alienate a lot of people. And I think he's already run through a lot of goodwill that the United States has built up very painfully over the years, and just squandered it for his own benefit. He has no appreciation in dealing with other democratic leaders, and he does it in a very public way, that when he puts them into a corner, as effectively he's done with Denmark and Greenland, which is a very serious issue for the United States. But when you put the Prime Minister of Denmark in a corner, she's not going to be in a mood to make reasonable agreements with you. She's going to defend Danish sovereignty over Greenland. And by the way, the elected government in Greenland isn't going to surrender to threats either. So I don't think Trump, this is part of his lack of understanding of international affairs. I'm known as a hardliner. I think that's a deserved reputation, but I'd like to think that I can appreciate that the other side, especially when they're a friend of ours, has a perspective that you have to take into account, and you work it out. And mostly you do it behind closed doors, because that's gives the greatest prospect for reaching a mutually satisfactory agreement. Trump doesn't understand this. He doesn't care about it. And the reason is he doesn't have a national security strategy, and he likes the publicity that Donald Trump gets by negotiating all this in public.
We have the Munich conference coming up this week, and there are reports that Trump might unveil his peace plan for Ukraine. What do you think you're expecting?
Well, I think it's entirely possible that we will learn a lot more about the administration's thinking. Vice President J.D. Vance will be addressing the conference. Keith Kellogg, whom Trump has named as his envoy on the war, will be there. So I think everybody will be watching it very carefully. You know, Trump said during the campaign he would get Zelensky and Putin in a room together and they'd solve the problem in 24 hours. Well, that hasn't happened. Now they're talking about maybe 100 days to 6 months after the inauguration. J.D. Vance himself said during the campaign he would favor a ceasefire along the existing front lines militarily, creating a demilitarized zone, and Ukraine promising not to join NATO. I don't believe he would have said that during the campaign if he hadn't at least spoken to Donald Trump about it. I think that's a disaster for Ukraine. That's the kind of plan that the Kremlin could have written. So I think the signs are not particularly good. I think what Trump wants is this war ended, off the table, behind him. He said that it would never have happened if he had been president. And interestingly, last week, Vladimir Putin agreed, saying the war wouldn't have happened if Trump had been president. So here's Vladimir Putin already flattering Trump, working on him. I'm very nervous about what this could lead to from Ukraine's perspective.
Also, when it comes to Ukraine, Trump has demanded a rare earth minerals deal, all while speaking directly to Vladimir Putin about a peace plan. What do you make of this?
Well, for Trump, everything is transactional, and he knows rare earths are a sensitive commodity. Although we've got a lot of rare earths in the United States, we just have environmental regulations that make it prohibitively expensive to mine. But possibly some kind of exchange like that, it would allow Trump to say, well, we're not just giving all this armament away to Ukraine, we're getting something for it. Let's see what could happen. I don't think there's any reason not to explore that if it would help sustain the flow of assistance to Ukraine. The Russians have rejected it, not surprisingly, but it shows there's going to be negotiations here. I think fairly soon. Whether they go anywhere or not is a different question. But I think both Ukraine and Russia are trying to position themselves to be in the most advantageous spot they can be as those negotiations come closer.
Ambassador, does it seem from a fourth person point of view that even if the war ends, Ukraine will still be on the losing side?
Well, I'm very worried about that. Trump thinks that international relations can be explained in terms of the personal relationships between leaders. So if he has a good personal relationship with Vladimir Putin, he thinks that the U.S. and Russia have good relations. That's ridiculous. I mean, personal relationships are important. President Trump has a good relationship with Prime Minister Modi. I think we all know that. But it doesn't mean that issues between the U.S. and India on trade, for example, are easily resolved. And the same is true in the Ukraine context. But the sort of the correlation of pressures and evidence right now leads me to be worried on behalf of Ukraine that Trump's inclination, his desire to get this war behind him, means he doesn't care particularly what the terms are on which the war is resolved. And I think that's bad news for Ukraine.
How do you think the United States is looking at its relationship with India right now?
Well, I think from the U.S. perspective, which may not be Donald Trump's perspective, the relationship with India is probably the most important bilateral relationship the U.S. will have for the rest of this century. And I think the critical question we face together is how to deal with China. I think the Asian Security Quad, which was really given a lot of energy by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, tragically now deceased, but Abe was able to get the leaders of Australia, India, and the U.S. and really make progress. I think progress was made on it during the Biden administration, and I hope that can continue because there are a lot of things that are going on. But I think if those four countries can see things in a similar way, I think for security in South and East Asia generally, that could be very important.
Since you mentioned Quad, do you think the grouping can find a new strategic meaning under Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think there's a real possibility. I just say, though, the experience in the first term indicates that all Trump could focus on in the meetings that I attended, the phone calls that I listened in on between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump focused on trade and complaints about India's trade practices and other things. Trade is a difficult issue between countries. There's a lot at stake economically for their respective populations. I understand that. But we are facing really big picture strategic issues here. And let's talk about trade. Yeah, yes, that's true. But let's keep our eye on what is really important. And if we can do that, then I think I am optimistic that we could make a lot of progress.
Right. Trump has been talking about threats from Iran. He claims one was even made on his own life. So Is it just political pettiness that he stripped you off your security that was granted for the very same reason, Iran?
Right. Well, I think it was a measure of Trump's character or lack thereof that he cut off not just my security, but former Secretary Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley. And Trump knows very well this is a serious threat. We're not talking about chatter on the internet here. We're talking about what our intelligence agencies have come up with over a sustained period of time. And that threat level is still very high, as it was back in 2021 when President Biden reextended Secret Service protection for me. So I think it was a petty step, but typical of the man.
Also, Ambassador, many are worried that Trump might go off the rails since it's his last term in the White House and practically a lame duck president. Do you share that worry?
Well, I think it is significant that he never has to face the voters again, and that was a constraint in the first term that was real. Often, if we couldn't get him to do the right thing based on policy reasons, we could say the political consequences of not doing it would be very negative for you, and that would always get his attention. Competing with that is the phenomenon that every lame duck president faces, and people should remember, although Trump's a new president and benefiting from that, he's also a lame duck president because he can't run for a third term, and we haven't had that since Grover Cleveland in 1892. So we have no contemporary experience with it. But lame duck presidents look to their legacy. They think about how they will be remembered in history. I don't know how that cuts. Many people think, well, that'll make Trump more reasonable. But Trump's idea of what a good legacy is not necessarily the same as reasonable people around the country. So it means there's even more uncertainty about how he will view the personal benefit to him, which is his highest decision-making criterion in this new situation for him of being a lame duck president.
And before I wrap up, I have one last question, Ambassador Bolton. You have gone on record to say that Trump is not worthy of becoming the president of the United States. But back in 2017, you had also agreed to become his national security advisor. I'm trying to understand how you and others switch sides. Even take J.D. Vance for an example. He once called Donald Trump a Hitler. Today he is serving side by side. I'm trying to understand, how does this happen?
Well, I went in the reverse direction from J.D. Vance, but when I became national security advisor, I believed that, like the other 42 presidents before him, that the weight of the responsibilities of the office, the gravity of the issues he had to decide, certainly in the national security field, would impose a kind of discipline on him. That these questions were too important to just handle in an offhand, casual way, and that because of that precedent of all the prior presidents and the issues I knew we were going to face, I thought we could work out sound American policies. And it turned out I was completely wrong. Nothing disciplines Donald Trump. He is concerned only about one thing, and that's how he appears. And that's what it was for the 17 months I was there. I'm, by the way, so far still his longest serving national security advisor. And I wish good luck to anybody who's in the administration now.
All right, Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for joining us on HT and speaking with me. It's always a pleasure sitting down with you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to do it. Stay in touch. It's going to be a long 4 years.